The hall held its breath. 7 council elders stood ranked at the edges of the stone dais, their ceremonial robes the color of old ash, and every face wore the same expression, the studied blankness of men who had witnessed this ritual many times before and found it unremarkable. The iron-banded doors had sealed behind her with a single low concussion of sound that the vault absorbed and returned as silence, and the hall smelled of cold stone and the particular mineral chill of a room kept immaculate for occasions, rather than for the use of anyone who lived in it. A girl. A name. A transfer of obligation from one pack's ledger to another's. Lucian Duskwalker had known, walking through the iron-banded doors of the Iron Spire throne hall, that she would be made small in this room. She had not known how efficiently it would be done. Elder Voss spoke first. He was a narrow man with a voice that carried without effort, the kind of voice that had never needed to raise itself to be obeyed. He lifted the treaty scroll with 2 fingers and read from it in the flat cadence of a man reading livestock assessments. Tribute received under the Greywood Compact, Article 9, Section 4. The Tribute Girl. 22 years, unmarked, Duskwalker lineage, presented in full accordance. She heard the word. Not her name. Not her family name spoken with any weight. The Tribute Girl. Filed, categorized, and set aside in the same breath, as though the woman standing in the center of the hall were a detail to be noted and moved past. She did not look at Voss. She looked at the man at the center of the dais, the one who had not yet spoken. King Doran sat in his chair the way a stone sits in still water, occupying space without asserting it, his stillness so complete it organized the room around itself. She had expected ceremony and display, the particular performance that men of great authority tended to mount when they wished to demonstrate the cost of their attention. What she found was the opposite of performance. His eyes settled on her once, long enough to register, and then he looked past her toward something beyond the hall's far wall. His eyes did not stay. She thought, in that first moment, that he had weighed her and found nothing worth recording. She would carry that interpretation for 16 days before anything in the room gave her reason to question it. If you have ever been given a label and watched a room accept it without pause, stay with this story. The 30 days that followed taught her something she did not expect from any of it. She had come from a pack that had nothing left to protect. The Duskwalker name had carried weight once, in the southern ranges, in years before she was born. She knew this the way one knows the shape of a room seen only in shadow, by inference rather than evidence. Her parents had died when she was 9. Elder Gan had administered the household after that. Administration in practice meant a gradual narrowing of what she was permitted to own, do, or become, conducted so steadily across 12 years that she had never been able to identify the exact morning the narrowing became a policy. She had noticed, in those years, that her name drew a particular attention from the Elder Council. A stillness when it was spoken in certain meetings. A careful rephrasing when it came up near her. She had noticed and had not known what the noticing meant, and she had learned the practical skill of filing observations that had no immediate use. Then the morning Gan called her to his study. The room smelled of old paper and tallow, and the single window gave onto the courtyard wall, admitting a pale winter light that made everything in the room look accounted for rather than lived in. He was seated with his hands flat on the table, the way he sat when he had decided something irreversible, and needed her to receive it without being able to name it as news. The Greywood Compact. Article 9. One girl of Duskwalker blood, presented to the Ironspire pack within 30 days of the Elder Council's demand, to be held for 30 days as proof of the peace compact, then released. You will go, he said. She had looked at his hands. She had not asked whether he had volunteered her or been asked for her. She had not asked what the Duskwalker name meant to the Ironspire pack, or why it was her blood the treaty required. 12 years in Gan's house had taught her which questions he would decline to answer and which refusals she was not currently equipped to make. She packed a single chest. She went. The Iron Spire was 3 days' travel north. She arrived in late afternoon and was taken directly to the tribute quarters in the lower east wing, a set of rooms with high windows and stone walls and the general quality of spaces designed to be adequate rather than welcoming. A fire had been laid in the grate, recently enough that the wood was still catching, the smoke running thin and pale before it found the flue. A tray sat on the table, bread and a clay cup, and a small pitcher of water. No one remained to greet her. She stood in the center of the room and took inventory. The north-facing window had a latch that did not close flush, leaving a cold thread of draft across the sill. She noted it and kept moving. She was practiced at this. The girl came that first evening, then again on the second. Wren was perhaps 17, with large dark eyes and a way of moving through doorways that suggested she had learned early to take up as little space in them as possible. She was an Omega of the Iron Spire household, assigned to attend the tribute quarters. She brought water in the morning and firewood in the evening, setting the split logs down against the hearthstone one at a time with a care that made no sound, as though even the fire deserved not to be startled. On the first evening, she delivered both without speaking. On the second evening, she sat down on the floor beside the hearth after setting the firewood down, and she looked at Lucian with the expression of someone who had calculated the cost of continued silence and found it higher than the cost of speech. "The elders say the tribute girls never last the full 30 days, she said. Lucian looked at her. What stops them? Some find reasons to leave early. Wren picked at the fraying cuff of her sleeve. Some just get very quiet and stop eating. Lucian straightened the edge of her own sleeve. Then I will be the exception. Wren's face did not settle into a smile. Something moved across it that was more careful than a smile, the particular calculation of someone deciding whether to believe a statement made under conditions that had not previously produced reliable statements. She left without commenting. The next morning she returned with the water and stayed an extra 10 minutes, and neither of them mentioned the staying. In the days that followed, Lucian learned the shape of the Iron Spire the way she had learned every place Gan had assigned her, by mapping who watched her and who did not, who spoke to her and who spoke around her, which silences were courtesy and which were architecture. The pack's hierarchy ran on clarity. She was the tribute girl. The phrase had traveled from Voss's scroll into the general grammar of the place. She felt it in the way attendants adjusted their posture when she passed. A small collective stiffening, shoulders drawing back by a degree, eyes finding a point slightly to the left of her face, as though looking directly at her required a permission they had not been granted. She felt it in the way pages avoided her eye at formal gatherings, in the specific quality of silences that followed when her name was spoken in rooms she was not expected to be standing in. She was 30 days. She was temporary. She was, in the precise social language of the pack, not worth the investment of sustained attention. This would have been entirely bearable if the king's attention had not been the single element she could not categorize. She saw him at the morning council reviews, where he sat at the end of the long oak table and received reports from his captains with the spare efficiency of a man who had decided long ago that every sentence should carry only its necessary weight. Reth stood at his left, close enough to receive a low word and far enough to give the impression of independent station, and he watched the room with the particular economy of a man cataloging everything that entered it. She saw Doran at the evening meals, which were less meals than occasions for Voss and the senior elders to position themselves against each other, while Doran ate something and gave no visible indication of listening or of not listening. He never addressed her directly. He never arranged to be absent from any room she occupied. He was simply present, contained and unreachable, and by the 6th day she had concluded that his stillness was the specific stillness of a man who has assessed something and found no reason to reassess it. She was wrong about this. She had no way to know it yet. On the 8th day, while she was in the library with the Pack law text, Doran walked the eastern corridor with Reth at his side. She was not present. She would not learn of the exchange until the 14th day, when Reth mentioned it in the tone of a man relaying a fact he had been waiting to see if she would find on her own. Voss had described her quarters, in passing, as sufficient. Doran had stopped walking. The north-facing room with the broken window latch is not sufficient. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. Reth confirmed the repair was completed within the hour. The second blanket appeared before nightfall. No note, no explanation, no indication from anyone in the household that anything had changed. When Reth told her this, she looked at him for a moment that was slightly longer than polite. They were standing at the entrance to the East Passage, and Reth held a rolled document in one hand without having opened it, the way a man holds something he has been carrying long enough that he has stopped thinking about putting it down. He had the compact, observant manner of a man who catalogued everything and disclosed a considered selection, and the way he offered this particular item had the precision of someone setting something down that he expected to be picked up. "Why are you telling me?" she said. He looked at the wall just past her shoulder. "Because you've been reading the room wrong." He walked away before she could answer. She stood with the new information in her hands and her old conclusion already reasserting itself, the way conclusions do when they have been held long enough to feel like facts. She filed the repaired latch. She held the second-hand report. By nightfall, she had returned to her original reading because she did not yet know how to build a different one from a single wool blanket and a correction she had not been present for. She went on being wrong for 2 more days. The cost came on the 16th day. The council chamber off the main hall was used on alternating mornings for formal reviews and on other days for administrative business that required witnesses but not ceremony. Lucian had no business there. She was crossing the adjacent courtyard with the Pack law text under her arm when she heard Wren's voice through the open arch. Not words, just the pitch of it. Too high and too carefully controlled, the sound of someone managing fear at close range. She went through the arch. The chamber held a winter cold that the shuttered windows had preserved since morning, and a bar of pale light fell through the high window across the flagstones in a long diagonal that did not reach the table. 3 Pack attendants stood along the far wall with the specific neutrality of people instructed to observe without involvement, their hands at their sides, their eyes forward. Elder Voss stood at the chamber's central table with a records ledger open before him, one ringed hand resting flat against the leather cover, his attention fixed on Wren, who stood at the table's edge. Wren's hands were pressed flat against her thighs, and her chin was lifted in the particular way of someone who has decided that showing nothing is the only available form of dignity. The issue, as Lucian gathered it in the first several seconds, was a misalphabetized section of the attendance records. Voss's method of addressing administrative errors was specific. He addressed them publicly, with witnesses, at sufficient length that the correction would propagate through the lower household. Wren's eyes were fixed on a point past Voss's shoulder. Her hands were entirely still at her sides. Lucian stepped between them. She did not deliberate. She registered the motion slightly after she had already completed it, the way one registers having caught something already falling. She was standing between Wren and Voss with the Pack law text in her hands and her back straight, and she met Voss's gaze directly. "The attendance ledger is under my study authorization," she said. Her voice came out level. "I borrowed it yesterday and returned it this morning. If the sequencing is wrong, the error is mine." This was a lie. The ledger had never been under any such authorization. The attending wolves knew this. She could see the knowledge crossing their faces. Voss regarded her for a moment in which the room went very still. "The tribute girl," he said, with a quiet deliberateness that made the label into its own form of public instruction, Does not hold study authorization over PAC administrative records. Then I will obtain it, she said. She did not look away. Somewhere in the quality of the silence that followed, something in the room adjusted, as though it had encountered a variable it had not expected to need to account for. One of the attending wolves glanced toward the archway. Lucian kept her eyes on Voss. She did not know Doran was in the archway until the exchange ended and she turned. He had not intervened. He had not spoken. He was simply present, his attention resting on the scene with a completeness that altered the air of the room, the way a weight alters the balance of a scale, changing the reading without producing any sound. The confrontation dissolved into the suspension of parties who had all seen something they needed time to process. Voss closed the ledger and dismissed the attendants and left, without meeting anyone's eyes. Wren touched Lucian's arm once, very lightly, before she too left. Lucian turned and met Doran's eyes across the empty room. He held the contact for the length of a single drawn breath. Something moved behind his expression, surfacing the way something moves beneath still water when the light changes, present and then gone, before she could be certain she had seen it. He held it for one breath, and then he turned, and the archway was empty, and the council chamber was very quiet, and she was left standing in it with the PAC law text in her hands, and no instruction for how to read any of what had just occurred. She stood there longer than she needed to. She noticed that she did. She did not see him again until the hour before the evening bell. The eastern corridor ran between the great hall and the council wing, and at the hour before the evening bell it was customarily unoccupied. Lucian had taken to walking it at that hour because it was the one stretch of the iron spire where she could move without being visible from more than one direction at a time, and the solitude had become something she relied on without quite intending to. She heard his footsteps before she turned. She knew them by then, their particular weight on stone, deliberate and unhurried, the sound a man makes who has never needed to announce himself and has therefore never learned to soften it. She knew them the way she had learned the gait of every senior household member, the way she had learned the uneven flagstones underfoot, without specifically trying. The nearest torch bracket burned with a low, steady smell of oil and heated iron, and the corridor held the specific quality of silence that comes from a space built wide enough that small sounds lose their edges before they reach the walls. She did not slow her pace. She did not quicken it. They met at the turn of the corridor where the high window threw a single bar of evening light across the floor. Doran stopped. She stopped. 4 feet of stone corridor between them, and the torchlight from the nearest bracket finding the angle of his face in a way that stripped the formal distance from it. The authority was still there. She could feel the weight of it the way a room feels weather before it arrives. Something beneath the authority was also there, brief and unguarded. Something that did not belong to kingship or to the careful management of public appearances. He looked at her. Not past her. At her, with the full weight of an attention she had been collecting evidence of for 16 days, and still had not allowed herself to read correctly. The quality of it registered in her body before her mind processed it, a warmth that moved from her chest outward without her permission, a breath she caught and held without thinking. She waited for him to speak. He did not speak. His hand lifted slightly from his side. The motion was brief and almost nothing, the kind of gesture that could be accounted for as a shift of weight, a small unconscious adjustment with no particular intent. It stopped before it completed anything. He held the pause for half a breath. Then his hand settled back. She looked at his face. The thing that had surfaced there had receded. His expression had returned to the stillness she had catalogued as indifference, the contained absence of warmth she had been reading for 16 days as a verdict on her standing. She felt the ground under the exchange reorganize itself. She felt the warmth she had registered leave her chest, replaced by the familiar cool of someone who has misread a room and is in the process of correcting the misreading. He nodded. once, with the precise neutrality of a man acknowledging another figure in a corridor. He walked past her. She stood at the turn for a long time after his footsteps faded. The evening light through the high window went from gray to the blue of full dark above her, and she stood in it and assembled, with the complete reasonable certainty of someone holding 16 days of evidence, what the exchange had told her. He had nearly spoken and chosen against it. The choice against it told her what she was to him. 30 days. The tribute girl. A ward of the treaty, to be acknowledged with a nod, and walked past. She thought she understood the distance now. She was wrong, as she had been wrong about the repaired latch and the extra blanket and the archway in the council chamber, and the pattern of her wrongness was the same each time. The same wall reconstructed from the same available stones, the only architecture she had been given enough material to build. What she did not know, standing in the cooling corridor with her old conclusion reinstated and her chest quiet and resigned, was that Reth had spent the better part of that afternoon in the sealed record room with a lantern and a packet of administrative papers dated 12 years before. The lantern in that room was a small oil-burning thing set on an iron stand, and the light it threw was too warm for comfortable reading and too uneven to be certain of anything, and Reth had been certain enough to bring the papers out anyway. They carried Elder Gan's seal, a wax impression in dark red that pressed deep into the fold, and what they described had not yet left that room to arrive at any door she could hear a knock on. The knowledge was coming toward her. She did not know its name or its weight. She was still living inside the story Gan had handed her on the morning he called her to his study, with his hands flat on the table, still believing that story contained everything there was to know about why she was here and what she was worth. The evening bell rang across the iron spire, a low, sustained note that the stone walls caught and carried before releasing it. She walked back toward the tribute quarters. The corridor closed behind her, torchlight and cold air and the particular silence of a hall that has absorbed a great deal and given nothing back, and the sealed records sat in Reth's hands 3 rooms away, waiting for the morning he would decide she had earned the right to know what was inside them. Reth came to the tribute quarters on the morning of the 20th day. The light through the north-facing window was the thin gray of early cloud, and the fire in the grate had burned low in the night and not been restocked. So the room held a cold that had settled at floor level and risen slowly the way cold does, in rooms where the stone is thick. He carried a packet of papers under his arm, sealed with a wax that had been broken and resealed, the way documents look when they have been examined by someone who needed to be certain before passing them on. He set the packet on the table without preface. He did not sit. He stood at the table's edge with his hands loose at his sides and looked at her for a moment with the cataloging attention she had come to recognize across 20 days of his particular brand of disclosure. "These are from the sealed archive," he said, "dated 12 years before your arrival. Read them before anyone else decides what they say." He left before she could ask him anything. She listened to his footsteps recede down the passage and then picked up the packet. The wax at the fold was dark red, deep pressed with Gan's seal, and it crumbled slightly at the edge where it had been resealed over the break. She read them. It took her most of the morning. The administrative language required patience, and she stopped several times at specific phrases that changed the shape of everything she had understood about the years preceding this room. The Duskwalker bloodline had not merely declined, it had been dissolved. Elder Gan had petitioned the Greywood Council 12 years before, citing the suppression of a bloodline with destabilizing claim potential to the Southern Range governance structure. The petition had been approved. The Duskwalker name had been officially removed from the pack record, its assets absorbed into the Gan household's administration, its standing formally voided before she was old enough to understand that standing could be taken the way other things were taken. She had been 9 years old when Gan filed the petition. She had thought she was sold because the pack needed her. She had been sold because the man administering her household needed her gone before she was old enough to understand what she was. The Duskwalker name, according to 3 separate archive notations Reth had marked with a folded corner, carried recognized lineage claim to territory that currently fell under Gan's administrative control. She sat with this for a long time. The fire was low and the room was still cold, and the thin winter light through the north-facing window moved imperceptibly as the cloud shifted. Wren came and sat on the floor beside her without being asked and without speaking, settling back against the hearthstone and drawing her knees up, her fraying cuff visible against her knee. She had learned in 3 weeks of proximity when speaking was the useful thing and when it was not. He knew, Lucian said eventually, not to Wren specifically. The words needed air. Wren looked at her. She did not ask who. She already knew. She had been filed as the tribute girl so that no one here would think to examine what the name was, or had been, or could still become, if someone said it aloud in a room with witnesses. She had been moved out of range. She picked up the packet, folded it closed, and held it in her hands. Reth had not explained why he showed her. She thought she knew. The knowing sat in her chest alongside something she did not permit herself to name, and she spent the rest of the 20th day in the library with the Pack Law text open to a page she did not read. On the 22nd day, she came around the corner from the library passage and found Doran in the corridor. He was alone. This was rare enough that she registered it as a break in the texture of the days, the way a misplaced stone registers underfoot before the eye confirms it. He was standing at the stretch of corridor where the single-wall sconce cast its light downward rather than outward, so that the lower half of the space was dimmer than usual, and she was nearly at the turning before she placed him. He did not step aside. She did not either. 4 feet of worn stone between them, and neither of them moved. "You are reading the Pack Law Archive," he said. It was not a question. "I have time," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. In the flat sconce light, she could see the careful arrangement of his expression beginning to shift. Not fully, not in a way she could have named, but a slight loosening at the edges of the contained stillness she had catalogued for 22 days. "The Duskwalker lineage," he said, and then he stopped. The corridor went very quiet. He had said 3 words and arrested the sentence before it arrived anywhere, drawn it back with the economy of a man who had permitted himself something and then reconsidered the permission. The stop was so complete it took the air from the exchange. She felt it the way she felt a door close, not slammed but latched with deliberate care, the sound precise and final. She waited. Nothing more came. What had surfaced in his face went back behind the contained stillness she had catalogued 22 days of evidence against, and she thought she understood. He had read the records or received a summary of them. He had started to speak and stopped because she was still the tribute girl, and whatever he had almost said would not survive contact with the treaty that governed what she was to this hall. "I see," she said. She walked past him. She kept her step even. She did not hear him move for a long time behind her. She was still wrong. She would not discover how wrong until the morning of the 26th day, when Wren came to the tribute quarters in the early hour before the household stirred, before the kitchen fires were banked up, or the first pages had moved through the east passage. The north window showed a sky that had not yet decided on its color, a thin, pale gray that gave no warmth. Wren stood in the doorway without knocking, and her face held an expression Lucian recognized, because she had worn its shape herself the morning Gan called her to his study. "He signed the papers," Wren said. "Voss invoked the treaty, the early release provision. Doran signed this morning." She said it without ornamentation because there was no shape to put around it that made it smaller. Wren stood holding the door frame with one hand, not for support, but because her hands needed something to do, and she watched Lucian with the particular stillness of someone who has delivered a thing and cannot now take it back. Lucian sat with it for the length of several breaths. She had 4 days remaining on a 30-day term, 26 days of 30, and Voss had found language in the treaty that allowed for early release, and Doran had used it. Every stone she had built the wall from, the repaired latch and the second blanket, and the 3 arrested words in the corridor, lay now on one side of a scale that held papers with the king's seal on the other side. She stood and opened the chest and began to fold things into it. Wren did not move from the doorway. She watched with her large dark eyes and the careful stillness of someone holding herself very still against starting to cry, and Lucian folded a sleeve and set it down and folded another, and did not look at her directly, because if she looked directly she would not be able to continue with the folding. She had her traveling coat laid across the bed, the wool heavy and smelling faintly of the cedar chips she had folded into it when she packed it 6 days north of her old life, and the pack law text sitting on the table, retrieved this morning from the library and not yet returned. She set the coat across the closed chest. She stood with the pack law text in her hands for a moment, then tucked it under her arm. A borrowed thing, technically. She would carry it as far as the outer corridor and see what it cost her to put it down. The escort formed in the lower east corridor at mid-afternoon. 4 wolves in iron spire livery, the dark gray and iron-banded uniform of formal household duty, with the correct, impersonal manner of men assigned an official obligation they had not personally arranged. She came down the corridor with her chest and her coat, and the pack law text tucked under her arm. The corridor at mid-afternoon held a flat gray light from the overhead windows, and the stone underfoot was the same uneven flagging she had learned in 26 days, the shallow dip at the 3rd flag from the arch, the section where 2 stones met in a raised seam that caught the foot if you did not remember it. Elder Voss was in the corridor. He had positioned himself between the corridor's bend and the outer door, in the way a man positions himself when he wishes to observe an ending without appearing to have arranged it. One ringed hand rested at his side, the same hand that had lain flat against the ledger cover on the 16th day. When she came within speaking distance, he let his gaze move over her with slow deliberateness, a final inventory conducted at leisure. "Safe traveling," he said. "Tribute girl." 3 syllables, applied with the same flat delivery he had used at the ceremony scroll and in the council chamber on the 16th day. Final, filed, dismissed, the way a ledger entry is closed and the book is shut. She stopped walking. The escort waited. She looked at Voss. She looked at the great hall's far arch, the iron-banded arch she had come through 26 days ago, with the sound of those doors sealing behind her still somewhere in her chest. She set her chest on the corridor floor. "I will not leave," she said, "until what was done to my name is said aloud in a room with witnesses." Voss drew himself up. "You have no standing here, you are. I know what you will call me." She turned toward the arch. She did not know whether Doran was in the throne hall. She knew only that Gan had spent 12 years arranging for her not to say a name aloud in any room where it might take hold, and she had walked into his study that morning and accepted the narrow shape he had assigned her without asking a single question worth asking, and she was done accepting it. Whatever the hall cost her, she would pay it standing in the center of it, which was the only position she had ever held there, and which had, she was learning, a kind of permanence to it if she did not move. She walked through the arch. The hall smelled the same as it had on the first day, cold stone and the mineral chill of a space kept immaculate for occasions rather than for the use of anyone who lived in it. Her footsteps crossed the floor in the particular way, footsteps crossed large spaces, small at first and then fuller as the vault picked them up and returned them. And the sound was the only moving thing in the room for the 3 seconds before she reached the center and stopped. The throne hall was not empty. 7 council elders in ash-colored robes, arranged at the edges of the stone dais. The same robes, the same dais, the same studied blankness of men who had witnessed this ceremony before and found it unremarkable, and who now looked at her with the collective calculation of 7 men determining whether she was authorized to be standing where she was standing. She walked to the center of the floor and stood in it. "I am Lucian Duskwalker," she said, to the 7 elders and to the hall, and to the stone walls that had received her silence for 26 days. The Duskwalker name was dissolved 12 years ago by Elder Gan under a petition he filed to remove the name's territorial claims from any future challenge. I have read the sealed records. I am asking that this be stated before witnesses, before I am removed from this hall. The hall was quiet for a long moment. One of the elders at the far edge began to speak. Voss had come through the arch behind her and was crossing the floor toward the dais, his pace carrying the specific urgency of a man who has lost the shape of an ending he planned, his robes making a dry whisper against the stone. She heard the iron-banded doors. The hall went very still. Doran came down the center of the hall with the release papers in his hand. Reth was half a step behind him, his posture carrying the quality of a man who has been present at a decision and has committed to its consequences. She recognized the papers by weight and seal, the specific document that had been signed and sealed and intended to move her out of this room without further incident. He stopped beside her, not at the dais, beside her on the open floor, with 7 elders looking down at both of them and the afternoon light through the high windows falling on the stone between their feet. He looked at her first, a single direct look that carried everything the corridor had not, the unfinished sentence handed back to her at last in a different form, in presence rather than in 3 arrested words. His face held none of the mask she had catalogued for 26 days. The contained stillness was there, but beneath it was the face of a man who had decided to stop managing his own expression. Then he turned to the elders. He tore the papers in half. The sound was brief and unremarkable, the sound of a decision made final. He folded both halves together and laid them on the stone floor. "The release is nullified." His voice carried its customary assumption of compliance, but it was aimed differently now, at a specific wall that needed to come down. The early release provision was invoked under Article 9, which governs tributes offered under standard blood claim. Elder Gan's petition of 12 years past dissolved the Duskwalker name for the express purpose of absorbing its lineage claims into his own administration. A tribute offered under a fraudulently dissolved name cannot be processed under Article 9. It must be named what it was. He turned to Voss. Elder Voss invoked a provision he knew did not apply. He has done so before 7 witnesses in this hall. His seat is suspended pending full council review of his conduct in this matter, and in the matter of the tribute designation applied to this woman across 26 days. Voss's face changed, not with anger, with the specific expression of a man who has, for the first time in a long career of positioning himself in correct places at correct moments, misjudged the precise arrangement of a room. He did not speak. He stood at the edge of the dais where his seat was, and he did not speak. Reth, at Doran's back, had already drawn a small notebook from his coat and was marking something in it with precise, economical strokes, the beginning of the formal record that would not wait. Doran turned back to her. 12 days ago, I signed those papers because Voss said the treaty required it, and because I had no language for what I actually wanted. He looked at her directly. I want you to stay. Not because of the treaty and not because of the name, though the name is yours, and its standing will be restored before this hall is cleared. I want you to stay because you walked into a council chamber on the 16th day and placed yourself between a girl with no defense and the whole weight of this hall's authority. And you did it without anything behind you, and I have not been able to set it down since. He said it in front of 7 council elders, and the stone walls and the high windows and the afternoon light and every person who remained in the hall. He did not retract a word of it. She looked at the torn papers. She looked at Wren, who had come through the hall's side door and stood at the edge of the floor with her hands pressed together, her dark eyes moving between Lucian and the king, and the shape of something she had been watching for 26 days. She thought of the packet. She thought of Gan's hands flat on his study table. She thought of 12 years of careful narrowing conducted so steadily she had never been able to name the exact morning the narrowing became a policy. She thought of Reth setting the records down and saying she had been reading the room wrong. She thought of the corridor on the 22nd day, 3 words arrested before they completed anything, and understood now what the arrest had cost him. "Yes," she said. The word was smaller than every sentence that had surrounded it, and it was exactly the right size. For one long pause, the hall held the word, the way stone holds warmth in the hours after a fire goes cold, slowly, in every direction at once, until the warmth becomes indistinguishable from the stone itself. Ren bowed, not to the king, to Lucian, the specific bow owed to a name restored, the kind that cannot be recalled once it has been given. 3 of the 7 elders followed the motion. The other 4 would require the formal record Reth was already preparing, his pen moving steadily in the small notebook, the soft scratch of it the only sound in the hall's upper register, and the Duskwalker name would need to be reinstated through proper council process, and Gan's administrative claim to the Southern Territories would be contested before a quorum before it was removed. And there would be days ahead that carried the specific weariness of necessary corrections performed through institutions that had not been designed to correct themselves easily. Those days would come. What was present in the hall on the afternoon of the 26th day was simpler than all of that. Doran's hand moved to his side and opened, in the way a door is left open rather than pushed through, and she reached out and set her hand in his, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. She was still holding the Pack Law text under her other arm. She had carried it through every doorway since the tribute quarters, all the way down the lower east corridor and past Voss and through the arch, and to the center of this hall, and she carried it still. She noticed that she did. She did not put it down. There was still a great deal to read.